How to use leisure meaningfully will become our nation's major problem.
Fat chance.
And $30,000 to $40,000 in 1966, by the way, we did the math, it's $199,000 to $260,000 in today's money. How did this happen? What was the philosophical story behind this? I'm real familiar with the conservative worldview because my father was a conservative and a Republican until the day he died. And when I was 13, I went door to door in 1964 for Barry Goldwater. I mean, 2 years later, I was getting tear-gassed at MSU, but I had been there. Went to the John Birch Society meetings, read John Stormer's None Dare Call It Treason, I knew about the communists in the State Department, the whole bit. But mostly I understood Russell Kirk. Russell Kirk in 1951 or 52 wrote a book called The Conservative Mind, which animated not only my dad, but it animated William F. Buckley, it animated Barry Goldwater. It is the Bible of the modern conservative movement. It's the first chapter of A Conservative Mind. It's still in print and still widely read. All of the conservative intelligentsia will speak of this book very highly. And this is not like a villainous philosophy. This is simply there's two ways to look at how a society should be. There's the conservative and the liberal way, traditionally. The battle goes back to John Adams versus Thomas Jefferson. John Adams wanted things to move very slowly and incrementally. Let's even emulate England in a lot of ways. He, in his third year of his administration, whenever he came through a town, the local militia had to line up and fire the cannons and say, "God save President John Adams." Let's just do it the way it's always been done. Whereas Jefferson was like, we need a revolution every 20 years. He saw revolution and change as a good thing. Those are the two fundamental worldviews. Conservative Mind opens with a story about Sir Edmund Burke. Sir Edmund Burke was a British philosopher and historian of considerable note and fame. He eventually supported the American Revolution, interestingly. And Thomas Paine went and spent 2 weeks at his house on his way to France, to the French Revolution, and got in this 2-week-long battle with Edmund Burke that he so PO'd Thomas Paine that Paine wrote an entire book called The Rights of Man as a rebuttal to Burke. Mm-hmm. Burke's most famous quote in my mind, and it's a little more old Englishy, but here's kind of the modern English version of it. He's talking about how you should have a ruling class and then you should have everybody else who just goes about their thing. He says, "It does me no harm if a man engages in a profession as servile as that of tallow maker, candle maker, or hairdresser. However, it does society considerable violence should such a man be allowed to participate in governance, in other words, to vote or to run for political office." That kind of thinking is the same kind of thinking that's animating these ALEC laws all across the United States right now. Let's suppress the vote. Let's reduce the number of voters. John Adams used to refer to people with lower economic means as the rabble. We don't want the rabble participating. In A Conservative Mind, Kirk basically predicted the American middle class was growing. By 1951, the American middle class was really a substantial thing. It was something that the world had never really seriously seen before. And he basically predicted that if they kept going like this, if this happens for another couple decades, you are going to see people who are going to have all this leisure time that Time magazine was writing about. And they're going to cause trouble. Because these people, this is the rabble, right? They go back to Thomas Hobbes' Leviathan, 1634. Without the iron fist of church or state, life would be nasty, short, and brutish, or nasty, brutish, and short. Hobbes arguably being the first of the modern-day conservative philosophers. So Kirk predicted that there would be chaos, political, economic, and social chaos, if the middle class got too large and too strong. Can't let that happen. So let's just incrementally, let's slow down the pace of some of this stuff. William F. Buckley famously said, "A conservative is a man who stands athwart the arc of history with his hand out shouting, 'Stop!'"
True.
And again, nothing wrong with that. It's a legitimate worldview. By 1971, Kirk was long gone. Kirk was probably still around, but his book had been out for a couple of decades. And in 1971, Lewis Powell was a soft-spoken lawyer, represented mostly tobacco interests, but others as well. I spent several months inside Lewis Powell's head, reading his writings, reading about him, reading a biography of him, watching videotapes of him, and have come to the conclusion. He wrote the famous Powell memo that really kicked off everything, the Reagan Revolution. Have come to the conclusion that he was actually a good and decent man of good heart and thought he was doing the absolute best for his country. That there was no villainy in this. Because in 1971, it looked like Russell Kirk's prediction was coming true. The birth control pill had been available for 10 years. Young people in particular were having sex like there's no tomorrow. Women were demanding the right to participate in the workplace. Young people were smoking dope and taking LSD. Young people were saying, no, hell no, I'm not going to go to that war. African Americans were saying, I thought we settled this back in the 1860s. And then, of course, you had the Civil Rights Movement in the 1960s, and you had several major pieces of legislation which were in the process of being implemented by 1971, and not fast enough. And you had cities that were burning. You had gay people saying, hey, what about us? Stonewall happened in 69. It was as if every sector of society that wasn't old, pale, and stale, it wasn't, white males, had just erupted. Everywhere these guys looked, what they saw was chaos. And they genuinely believed that this was not good chaos. That this was the kind of thing that leads to Bolshevik revolutions. This is the kind of thing that brings down governments. This is the kind of thing that destroys societies. Religious institutions, people weren't going to church like they used to. Divorce, people were getting divorced. Women were openly talking about abortions. This was 2 years before Roe v. Wade. D&Cs in the hospital, this procedure that young women would go in and have, everybody knew they were simply abortions in the hospital. And they were very, very widespread. And there was a lot of discussion about this kind of thing. And should we legalize abortion? And so all these different things that were happening that represented challenges to the established order, not just to the power of the established order, but just to the established order. For those people who think that society should move slowly and gradually, this was a freak show. This was a horror show. And so Lewis Powell wrote this memo to his neighbor and good friend Louis Sindor, and he said, oh, and that was the social part of it. Then there was the business part of it, and I don't get to the memo. The business part of it was that in 65, 66, I forget the year, Rachel Carlson wrote Silent Spring. They had figured out that DDT was not only killing insects, which are pretty necessary because they're at the bottom of the food chain, but also that it was causing the eggshells of birds' eggs to thin out to the point that they weren't hatching young eggs. And she said, if we keep, and I remember in the 50s as a kid, the planes going over and spraying DDT over our house for mosquito control, and we had to go out and dust it off the car. And so what Rachel Carlson said was, whether or not DDT is toxic, and there's some indication that it might be, it is definitely toxic to bugs and to birds. And one day we're going to wake up and the spring is going to be silent. And that's going to be the beginning of the death of the earth. 2 years later, Ralph Nader published Unsafe at Any Speed. So you had Dow Chemical and Monsanto and the whole chemical industry under attack from an environmental movement that Rachel Carlson had started. And then you had a consumer movement that was saying, hey, wait a minute, are you guys seriously calculated this $2.35 fix for the gas tanks so they wouldn't explode and decided not to do it because, a human life you figured was, only 1 out of 10 people would sue and they'd only get $200,000 and you do the math and it's cheaper not to put the bolt in? I mean, really? Which is the stuff that Ralph Nader was exposing. And so the corporate lawyer, Lewis Powell, and the social conservative Lewis Powell looked at this and said, we're under siege. In fact, the Powell memo basically opens with a, we're under siege. And he said, we've got to get control of public opinion. We need to create think tanks that will push these ideas out so that instead of Rachel Carlson being on the cover of Life magazine or instead of Ralph Nader being on the cover of the Reader's Digest, it's one of our guys. And out of this, broadly, came the Heritage Foundation, the Charles Koch Foundation, which is today known as the Cato Institute, and the American Enterprise Institute, and all of these other conservative think tanks to push these ideas out. We've got to take control of state legislatures. This led to the creation of the American Legislative Exchange Council, ALEC, where lobbyists and state lawmakers sit literally side by side, 50-50, and vote on model legislation that then gets introduced into state legislatures. We've got colleges that are hotbeds of Marxism. Look at what's going on the campuses. They're shutting them down. It's like we've got to do something about this. And so now you have billionaires and large corporations that are funding chairs, particularly in the econ departments and the history departments, where only conservatives are allowed to teach. And then he said, we got to take control of government itself. And we got to take control of the courts. And out of that came the Federalist Society. More than half of all our judges now are Federalist Society members, which is a very, very conservative organization. Oh, and we got to take control of the media. In fact, back in the 70s, in the early 70s, there was a guy in the Nixon administration who had this very similar idea. Went to Richard Nixon and said, hey, let's start this thing called GOP TV, where every day we come up with the Republican talking points, Republican take on the news, and we send them out on airplanes to TV stations all over the United States, the tapes. This was before they had internet delivery and satellites. We send them out every night, call it GOP TV.